Want to advertise your business in a cost-effective way? It's time to give podcast advertising a try. Research shows a high rate of podcast listeners made a purchase as a result of an ad they heard on a podcast. Visit podbean.com/brands to launch a cost-effective podcast advertising campaign in minutes. That's podbean.com/brands.
Lady Justice is a true crime podcast, therefore deals with incidents of violence, disturbing imagery and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. The Lady Justice podcast wishes to offer their deepest condolences to the victims' families and wishes to offer thanks to those that work in emergency services. Hello my lovelies and welcome to Lady Justice, a true crime podcast. Lady Justice is a weekly podcast that covers fascinating cases, both past and present. My name is Chantal and I'm your friendly true crime junkie with slight caffeine addiction issues. I hope you're all incredibly well and enjoying a terrific week. It is almost Halloween, and because my next episode doesn't come out until November 3rd, I just wanted to wish you guys a happy Halloween, and I hope that you stay safe out there whilst you enjoy yourself. I'll probably be doing some trick-or-treating with my little humans and then heading inside to binge on some horror films. Now, as always, before I get into this week's episode, I just want to ask you guys a huge favour. Please support this podcast by subscribing, leaving a review, hopefully positive, and because sharing is caring, I do want you guys to go tell your friends, your family, colleagues, basically everyone you know. It does make the world a difference, and as always, if you would like to contact me about anything at all, please feel free to do so via social media or my email, which you'll find in the show notes. On social media, I'm basically Lady Justice podcast on everything. It's been a great but very busy week for me, and I'm very excited to get into part 2 of the Reg Christie case. So if this is the first episode you're tuning into, please go back one episode so that you are all caught up with the rest of us. Reg Christie was an intellectual man, but an appalling criminal. His need for stimulation led him down a path of misdemeanours, but when that didn't satisfy anymore, he decided he would kill. Previously, we took a deep dive into Christie's childhood, early crimes and his first 2 known murders. In this episode, we're going to be centering on his next 3 known murders and his part in one of the most significant miscarriages of justice the UK has witnessed. So, without further ado, I just want to give a shout out once again to Leon for requesting this case, and I just want to give a little background on the landscape in which these murders took place. This case takes place in the Notting Hill area of London, and we left off in 1944. The UK was still gripped in the Second World War. As always, all my sources will be listed in the show notes. So let's get on it like a car bonnet. So we're going to be jumping back into this story at the beginning of January 1947. Timothy Evans met a radiant young woman via a blind date arranged by a mutual friend. Her name was Beryl Susanna Thorley. She was born at the Lewisham Workhouse and Charitable Hospital on September 19, 1929. Her father William worked as a petrol pump attendant, and her mother Elizabeth worked as a housekeeper within the Lewisham area. Beryl was the eldest of 4 close siblings that grew up fast after their mother's death at some point during their childhood. By the time Beryl was 17, she had grown up to be a respectful and pretty young woman. Living in Cambridge Gardens at Kensington, she worked as a telephone operator in a popular Mayfair hotel. She had a wide circle of friends, and she was just embarking on adulthood. Timothy John Evans was born on November 20th, 1924, in the South Wales town of Merthyr Tydfil. His father, Daniel Evans, worked in the local mines. However, soon after discovering his wife, Thomasina, was pregnant with Timothy, he did a midnight flit, never to be seen by any of them again. His mother, struggling to bring up Timothy and his older sister, decided to get remarried, and in 1929 she did so. A younger half-sister was born, and the family then moved to London in 1935 for better job opportunities. As a child, it soon became apparent that Timothy was not the sharpest tool in the shed, as they say. He was behind on every childhood milestone, slow to crawl, slow to walk, and slow to talk. As a youngster, whilst bathing in the river, he cut his foot on a rock. This soon became infected and needed regular hospital treatment. Due to this, he missed an awful lot of schooling, leaving him almost illiterate. He was almost unable to recognise his name written, let alone write it himself. His headmaster was later to say that he often played truant due to the teasing from fellow students. He left school at age just 13 and began manual work such as painting and decorating. When he was assessed later in life, it was reported that he had only developed a mental age of 12 years old. The issues of being consistently behind developmentally and the bullying from his peers left him an angry child. He would frequently lie, even his own family began to distrust him. He was sent back to Wales at times to stay with his maternal grandmother and aunt to help curb his behaviour. These lies weren't the usual, "Oh no, the dog ate my homework," or the "Oh God, I didn't eat your Doritos whilst I'm covered in cheese dust." He lied even when it wasn't necessary. Full, rich fantasies that he would tell anyone that would entertain him. When very young, his violent temperament began to show. His mother was to later claim in a subsequent inquiry. He was pretty rough at times. Sometimes he used to wander, and he was a bit rough as everyone knows he was backward. If he didn't get his own way when he was a child, he used to kick and scream, and if he didn't want to go, he would not go. When Evans was older, he lived with his mother at 11 St Mark's Road, Notting Hill, London, and found a job as a van driver. He liked boozing, going to the cinema, and betting on the dogs. Tim filled a large amount of his spare time at the local pub, the Kensington Park Hotel. This is where he would indulge his lies and tell them to all who would be prepared to listen. One of these fantasies was that his brother, though he did not actually have a brother, was a rich Italian count with a fleet of cars. Evans himself used to boast that he could have any woman he wanted. However, when he met Beryl on that blind date, he instantly fell in love with the beauty and did his best to woo her. She fell for him quickly too, and they met each other's families soon after. Seemingly happy, though perhaps naive, they decided to marry as soon as Beryl was to turn 18 years old. On September 20th, 1947, the day after her birthday, the young couple were wed at Kensington Registrar Office. The ceremony was paid by Timothy's mother in full, possibly hoping that the marriage would bring out the best in her son. If you watch any of the films or television dramas about what happened at 10 Rillington Place, you will often see that Timothy Evans is usually portrayed as a dim-witted yet kind-natured man. This was not necessarily the case. He drank heavily and was known to threaten people. He also had a criminal record from 1946 when he was charged with theft. The couple was living at 11 St Mark's Road with Timothy's mother and stepfather, and they often rowed but made up quickly. Many times his mother would step into these arguments, making her son retreat from shouting at his wife and occasionally beating her up. In the early part of 1948, they discovered that Beryl was pregnant with their first child. The couple decided they should try and make their own way in the world and found a place for themselves. Just around the corner, the run-down flat at 10 Rillington Place was like many others in the area. England at the time was still under rationing. Money was tight and every little penny mattered, so a new coat of paint on the walls was the last thing on many's mind. They viewed the top floor flat that comprised of 2 rooms with a small kitchenette. They had access to a shared bathroom and toilet located outside in the rear yard of the property. Once they took up the landlord's offer, they moved in as a couple during the Easter, and by October 10th they grew into a family as their daughter Geraldine was born, a beautiful newborn with chubby cheeks and beaming eyes. In the early days of living in the cramped flat, they struggled to find a routine. Timothy often spent his time drinking in pubs before going home and taking out his frustrations on Beryl. This was commented on a lot by neighbours and friends who could not avoid the situation. With a young mouth to feed, money became an issue, and Beryl sought out some small part-time work in a newsagent just down the road from the family home. Trying to supplement her husband's wage, deal with her husband's abuse, and take care of a young child and home at just the age of 19 must have been enormously stressful. Timothy barely thought of how this could have been for his wife and often made snide remarks about her housekeeping skills. It honestly doesn't matter what is going on in your life, how capable you are. When you have a young child, sometimes you do just need to let things slide. Sometimes it is better just to get a 20-minute nap rather than do the washing up. With a relationship that was growing ever difficult, there were rumours that both Timothy and Beryl were having affairs. This came to a head in the autumn of 1949 when Beryl found out she was pregnant again. Initially, due to the Chinese whispers, Timothy was reluctant to believe that the unborn child was his, stating that it must be a baby of somebody else. Panic had set in for the couple. There were financial worries. They could barely afford to keep themselves afloat. The increasing violence and abuse that Tim was inflicting on his wife, and the cramped living conditions started to play on the mind of the two. Abortion was illegal in England during this time, and it was not actually made legal for almost a full 20 years later. The cost of a backstreet abortion at the time was about £1, which would have been an awful lot of money for the young family in a post-war London. This said, though, it was something they considered. The Evans and the Christies had grown somewhat close in the time that they had lived in the same property. Reg and Ethel often welcomed in Tim and Beryl's guests to wait at theirs if they were out, providing a hot cup of tea and a sticky bun. As I discussed on the previous episode, Christie loved to over-exaggerate his expertise in the medical field, only taking a first aid course whilst in the police and reading a few medical books. He claimed he had a doctor's knowledge. This led the naive and scared couple to ask Reg if they knew anybody that could help them with their proposed abortion. He was a much older man than both Tim and Beryl, and you can imagine they saw an almost father figure in the downstairs neighbour. He claimed that he could help and asked for some time to make some arrangements, stating that he could, in fact, perform the procedure for free as a favour to the family. On November 8, 1949, Tim left for work, leaving his wife and daughter by the door of their flat. It was the day they had planned with Christie to perform the illegal abortion, and the nerves were felt in the air. Tim promised the upset Beryl that he would come visit her from work as soon as he had the chance. Kissing them goodbye, he would never see them alive again. Later that day, the medical expert Reg Christie appeared at the flat, holding a glass jug filled with a liquid and some piping. He proceeded to explain what was to happen, and then asked Beryl to put Geraldine down before sitting at the kitchen table. She did so, nervously, and after attaching the homemade mouthpiece, she began to breathe in the same deadly mixture as Muriel had previously done. She did not die at this point, as evidence from the post-mortem recorded that she had actually had facial bruising and evidence of sexual assault before her death. What had happened is that Christie had waited until the moment the 20-year-old Beryl was unconscious. Then he raped her. As he had done previously with both Ruth and Muriel, he strangled her during intercourse, and then it is presumed that he also sexually assaulted Beryl after death. This is fucking horrific to say, but baby Geraldine was still in the flat as this happened. To cover up his crime, he then picked up the petite woman and placed her in bed, covering her still frame with bed sheets before waiting on Timothy to come home. When he did, he explained that there had been an issue with the abortion and unfortunately Beryl had died. Leading Tim to her body, he then described the gravity of the situation to the feeble-minded man. Abortion was illegal. This was going to get Tim sent to prison. He'll be a single man with a baby to look after. It almost looks like you killed your wife. Piling guilt and confusion on Timothy, he then brought his devil's deal to the table. He offered Tim a solution to all of his issues. Christie could save him. Christie suggested that if he could help take the body of Beryl to the middle flat, whose occupants were on holiday at the time, Christie would then dispose of the body of the young mother down the main sewer drain outside of the house. No one would know. His solution to single fatherhood? Christie suggested that he knew of a couple that lived in East Acton that would be prepared to take on the almost 13-month-old girl, giving her a good life, and that he would be free to move on. This would only work, though, on one condition. Timothy Evans must make himself scarce. Go back to Wales. Christie suggested all of this whilst pounding into Timothy's mind that the abortion was the reason why he would go to prison, that no one would believe him if he said he knew nothing about it. Timothy agreed, wanting all of the grief and fear to go away. He went back to his birthplace in South Wales to stay with his aunt and uncle. They inquired about his wife and child, but he brushed questions aside, first stating that Beryl had gone to visit her brother in Brighton. They were unsure whether to trust Tim's word, knowing that he had a history of telling tall tales. They wrote to Beryl's brother, but soon received a note saying that she was not with him, nor had been in the past month. Going back to London a few days later, Tim went to ask Christie about Geraldine and her welfare. Christie had told him that the child was with the family and he wasn't allowed to see her anymore. Defeated, he returned to his aunt and uncle, who then pressured him to contact the police. He did so, but not in the way that anyone had expected. This was to seal his fate. On November 30th, 1949, Timothy Evans entered the police station. He was concerned for the safety of his 13-month-old baby Geraldine. Where was the baby's mother? They questioned him. Dead, he said to them. Died in unusual circumstances. What unusual circumstances? He informed them that she was pregnant again. A man had supplied him with fluid to abort the unborn child. He'd given it to his wife Beryl to drink. She died. He stuffed her body down a manhole outside the dwelling where he lived. He then arranged for Geraldine to be looked after before returning to his hometown. Now, the investigation and trial of Timothy Evans could be an entire episode on its own. There was just so much information. But I'm going to do a quick summary as only some of it really relates to Christie. When police searched the drain outside the front of the building, they found nothing. Moreover, it was discovered that the manhole cover was so heavy that it would have taken 3 officers to remove it. The police then re-questioned Evans, who altered his story and said that Christie had offered to perform the abortion on Beryl. Evans stated that he left Christie out of the first statement in order to protect him. On November 8th, Evans had returned home from work and Beryl was deceased. Christie then said that he would dispose of the body and make arrangements for the couple from East Acton to look after Geraldine. Christie had said that he would dispose of the body. He said that Evans should leave London for the meantime, and on November 14th, Evans left for Wales to stay with relatives. Evans said that he later returned to 10 Rillington Place to ask about Geraldine, but Christie had denied him to see her. In response to Evans' second statement, the police conducted a search of the property in question, but did not uncover anything incriminating, despite the presence of a human femur supporting a trellis in the tiny garden. On a more thorough search on December 2nd, the police found the body of Beryl Evans wrapped in a tablecloth and blanket in the wash house located in the back garden. Access to the locked wash house was only possible by using a knife kept by Mrs. Christie. The body of Geraldine was also found alongside Beryl's body. Evans had not mentioned he had killed his daughter in either of his statements. Beryl and Geraldine had both been strangled. The remains of a 16-week male fetus were also discovered. Evans reported he did not know that his daughter was dead until the police had told him about the body. When Evans was shown the clothing taken from the bodies of his wife and child, he confirmed the clothes were theirs. He was also informed at this time that both of them had been strangled. He was asked whether he was responsible for their deaths. Evans allegedly said, "Yes. Because of this, Timothy Evans was charged with the murders. The local police knew of his reputation as a notorious liar and used this to continually undermine him whilst he tried to defend himself. He then apparently confessed to having strangled Beryl during an argument over debts and strangled Geraldine 2 days later, after which he left for Wales. The police had interrogated Evans over the course of late evening and early morning hours to his physical and emotional detriment. He was a man already in a highly emotional state. Evans later stated in court that he thought he would be subjected to violence by police if he did not confess. This, along with the shock of discovering the bodies of his wife and daughter had been strangled, likely induced him to make a false statement. Remember also that Tim was an illiterate man, so confessions would have been written by police. The police investigation was marred by a lack of forensic expertise, with significant evidence overlooked. By the time of his trial, beginning on 11th of January 1950, Evans had recanted his previous confessions and pleaded innocence, claiming that Christie was the culprit. Christie, a key witness in the trial, denied having any part in either Beryl's or Geraldine's death. In accordance with the legal standards at the time, the prosecution proceeded only with the sole charge of murder, that regarding Geraldine. Beryl's murder, in which Evans was still formally charged, though not trialed, was used as evidence in helping to establish Evans' guilt in the murder of Geraldine. Despite his criminal history, Christie was not considered a suspect by police, and it did not much affect the jury either. Helping him was the fact that he had served in the police force during World War II, something that the jury found respectable. He listed his many ailments, claiming due to his back issues, it would have been impossible for him to have lifted the body. In the subsequent inquest into the miscarriage of justice against Evans, it was proven that witnesses were in fact re-interviewed and statements changed by the police. Evidence such as timesheets of workmen that were in the property during November had also gone missing. Evans' alibi that he was at work was not even checked by police. No witness information was passed on to Tim's defence team either. Basically, it was a major fuck-up. The jury took just 30 minutes to decide Timothy's fate based predominantly on Christie's testimony. They decided he was guilty. A neighbour who was around about 14 years old at the time recounted later in life. I keenly remember the day he was sentenced. I had visited a corner shop after school where I encountered John Christie. He smiled at me, bought me an ice cream. He told the shop owner that Evans got what he deserved. In England at the time, the death penalty was still in force, and on the 9th of March 1950, Tim Evans entered the gallows at Pentonville Prison and was hung by the neck. Now, after the trial, Christie lost his employment at the Post Office Savings Bank due to his undeclared criminal record being exposed during the well-publicised trial. Christie was then to find alternative work as a clerk at the British Road Services. At the same time, new tenants began to lease the other 2 flats at 10 Rillington Place. The tenants were predominantly black immigrants from the West Indies. This appalled the Christies, who regarded the neighbours as inferior and disliked living with them. The Christies held extremely racist views and had canvassed politicians to keep them out of the area. Tensions between the new tenants and the Christies came to a head when Ethel Christie prosecuted one of her neighbours for assault. By 1952, Christie's mental and physical health was deteriorating quickly. He often called on a neighbour at number 3 Rillington Place for help with his back problems, and he was often complaining of bouts of insomnia, headaches and blackouts. This began to increase in frequency, and this led Reg to seek advice from his doctor. He was urged by the doctor to spend some time in a local hospital. He refused, worrying about leaving Ethel at home now black families had moved into the building. Christie, being the medical marvel that he was, self-diagnosed his ailments, blaming the stress of having to live in the same building as a black family. Basically, he was a fucking nincompoop. During this time, Ethel was also enduring some mental distress. In the time between the trial of Timothy Evans and late 1952, the Christie marriage was severely damaged. It is highly unlikely that Ethel had not at least suspected the truth that Christie may have been involved in the young mother's and infant's death. Letters to her family, although still regular, seemed unlike the happy Ethel they once knew. Some of these letters were auctioned off in 1998 for £4,600. They provide a clear example of the pressures Ethel was enduring. Her need to escape not just her unhappy marriage, but the house in which Beryl and Geraldine were murdered in. Stating in one letter to her younger sister, she wrote, "I just want to move." The shame of Christie's criminal past being exposed during the trial, issues with his employment thereafter, and his naturally controlling behaviour must have led to some strain. The decline in her mental health, whether stemming from living in what would today be considered an abusive relationship, or just a hard life living in London during wartime, was just showing on her physically. Her weight had increased, and she looked considerably tired. Her eyes seemed dimmed, and this is especially apparent if you take a comparison photo of Ethel from her youth to a later image in her marriage. I think what I'll do is I'll post some of these on the show's Instagram page during the week so you can see exactly what I mean. At 8:15 a.m. or thereabouts on December 14th, 1952, Christie strangled his wife of 33 years as she slept with a stocking. In interviews just a few months later, he stated, "On December 14th, I was awakened by my wife moving about in bed. I sat up and saw that she appeared to be convulsive, her face was blue and she was choking. I did what I could to try and restore breathing, but it was hopeless. It appeared too late to call for assistance. That's when I couldn't bear to see her, so I got a stocking and tied it around her neck and put her to sleep. Then I got out of bed and saw a small bottle and a cup half full of water on the small table near the bed. I noticed the bottle contained 2 phenyl barbiturate tablets, and it originally contained 25. I then knew she must have taken the remainder. I got them from the hospital because I couldn't sleep. I left her in bed for 2 or 3 days and didn't know what to do. Then I remembered some loose floorboards in the front room. I had to move the table and some chairs to roll back the liner about halfway. Those boards had previously been up because of the drainage system. There were several of these depressions under the floorboards. Then I believe I went back and I put her in a blanket or a sheet or something, and I tried to carry her, but she was too heavy, so I had to half carry, half drag her and put her in the depression and cover her up with earth. I thought that was the best way to lay her to rest." Christie told neighbours that Ethel was away visiting family and even wrote Christmas cards to Ethel's family on her behalf, insisting that she was too ill to hold a pencil. He maintained his respectable, sociable public persona and continued to lie to all those around him, telling neighbours at number 9 that she had sent a telegram to inquire how they were, and convincing those that tried to find further information out that he was to join her soon, as she missed him terribly. Over the Christmas period, he was to sit in the living room in which Ethel's body lay just below his feet. He would talk to her and later said when interviewed why he did not remove the remains and put them in the garden as he had done with Ruth and Muriel. "I think in my mind, I did not want to lose her." A post-mortem was held on Ethel's body after she was discovered. It was unable to determine whether Christie's claims of Ethel's apparent suicide attempt, although many say they do not believe this to be true, and believe the possible reason for Reg's killing his wife was much more plain. As Ethel's health had declined, she had spent more time at home. Her visits to the north of England to visit her family had also begun to decrease. Now, it could be suggested that her visits to the north had reduced in frequency because of her potential suspicions. This could be concluded from some of her letters. She indeed did feel uneasy about her husband and the circumstances around the murders of Beryl and baby Geraldine, especially after hearing the evidence at the trial. Although neighbours found it odd that Ethel never said goodbye, they trusted the man who licked his lips as he spoke and believed that she had just gone off in a rush to visit family. Her family were slightly concerned that Ethel had not written to them as often as she would typically do, but they also knew that life can sometimes get in the way. This was 1952. This means that most people living long distance kept in contact via good old snail mail. Sometimes letters got lost or delayed, and it could all be easily explained away. With Ethel departed, Christie was isolated in the flat. Christie was later to admit that after Ethel was no longer living in the property, it was much more convenient to commit murder, declaring in an interview, "When I murdered my wife, I removed the one obstacle which for 10 years apparently held me in check. After she was gone, the way was clear for me to fulfill my destiny." And that is as far as this episode will go, unfortunately. There has been a lot of information covered and there is still so much to go. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and of course part 1 of this case, and I'd love to hear from you guys, so please reach out to me via email or my social media. Just search for Lady Justice Podcast, you'll see the logo and you'll know it's me. This week's recommendation is extremely exciting for me, even if it's not related to true crime. One of the most exceptional people I met at university is embarking on his first ever podcast. Launching on Tuesday, 66 Degrees Nerd is a podcast that will be focusing on topics associated with the world of geeks, nerds and popular culture. From video games to movies and technology to board games, there's a little bit of everything in between too. It's hosted by my friend Sam, who's a writer originally from London and has been living in Iceland for about 4 years. The passion he has for all things nerdy has bonded him with those that he cares about. I'm just super proud of him and delighted for him. I'm going to pass you on to him now just so he can explain what everything's about.
Greetings and salutations, potential friends and listeners. My name is Sam and I'm the host over at 66 Degrees Nerd. We're a podcast dedicated to all things to do with geek culture, nerd culture and popular culture. You can expect us to talk about video games, movies, technology, board games, and a hell of a lot more stuff in between. Our first episode is due out in just a few days, where I'll be covering a few of the video games that I've been playing recently. I hope you'll come and listen to us.
I will link his social media in the show notes so you can reach out to him and learn more. I'll also drop in the show notes where you can listen to the show. So please give him a listen and don't forget to subscribe and review. Now, after all this death, I hope you're ready to put some goodness back in the world. This week's small act of kindness will literally cost you the same as a cup of coffee, because that's precisely what it is. That's right, go along to your local coffee shop and buy an extra cup. It's called suspended coffee, and it can be redeemed by anyone in need of a cup of joe that can't afford it. As the weather changes and things are getting a little colder out there, it could really help someone in need, and it honestly doesn't cost too much. So have a rummage around in your pocket, find some change and buy a suspended cuppa for someone who isn't as lucky as you. I will link a website that has a directory of cafes that support suspended coffee, but I also know that many other big coffee chains also commit to the idea of buying a coffee for someone in need. So go be good people, go be kind, go be safe, and most importantly, go be happy. Toodle pip and cheerio.